Hello and welcome to Words with Ro. If you're joining me for the first time, you don't know that I've been absent from my channel for a few weeks, and it's actually for a very good reason. I've been really busy with work, really busy with auditions. I've had the most insane auditions that I only could have dreamed of having a few years ago. So, as they say, everything happens at the same time. And I also was at the Cannes Film Festival. So, yes, it's been an extremely busy time. And when you're moving around and in airports and hotel rooms and Airbnbs, you just don't always have the time to do something to camera. And I know you might say, well, you could have done a live or something like that. But to be honest, I'm not really good at that sort of thing. I'm just sort of finding my way with my YouTube channel. But I've decided to come back today with a gift for my followers and my new followers. And what it is a few small steps to help you get into poetry. We don't always realize when something sort of comes easy to us, maybe not easy, we've worked at it, but we weren't intimidated by it in the first place, that some people still struggle with that. So I've had a few messages from supporters saying, Ro, tell me how to read poetry better. So I've broken it down into a few small steps. We're not going to analyze poetry or anything like that. We're not going to dive deep. This is just a few small steps to give you the confidence to look at a poetry book or read a poetry magazine or search for one online and have the confidence in yourself to know that you are capable of reading it. So let's go. Okay, so my first tip in getting into poetry is do not be intimidated. Unfortunately, there are people in this world that think that their level of knowledge in every field across the board is superior to others. People think their knowledge to wine is superior, their knowledge to fashion is superior, pop culture is superior. And poetry sometimes feels like that world, like a mysterious world, and that poetry is something that needs to be decoded. And oh, I'm not sure if I'm intelligent enough to do that. Poetry is words, and nobody owns words. Words are what you make of them. Some of the best poetry that we have in our modern times is actually rap music. So don't be intimidated by poetry. It's just words. So before you approach it, just relax and say to yourself, I can do this. I use words every single day. That's all it is. It's just a bunch of words. Okay, so my next tip on getting into poetry is read it slow. This mightn't seem obvious and it mightn't come naturally to you, but the reason that we read it slow is to let the words sink in. We let the imagery sink in and we let it wash over us. If you're intimidated, going back to step one, by reading the poetry, you might just rush in. Sometimes actors do this, they learn a monologue and then they speed through it and they don't take time to feel out their thought process, their emotional process, and what they're going through. And this is the same with poetry. Just take it slow. Use the punctuation. And sometimes even punctuation can be intimidating. But the minute you see one of those little commas, just take a tiny pause. And sometimes the sentences, yes, do run into one another, but just read it slow. Also, it's really important that you read it out loud. Maybe read it for somebody else. Read it a second time for them, a third time, and enunciate. Make sure that every single word can be heard because every single word is there for a reason. And I guarantee you, I really guarantee you this, when you start reading it slow, you'll start feeling the emotions of the writer. Okay, so my next step in reading poetry out loud was kind of covered or mentioned in step two, or tip number two. It's enunciation. So enunciation essentially is saying the whole word. And sometimes, depending on our accent, it can be quite difficult. Essentially, we might pronounce it wrong depending on our accent. For example, um, me being born in Ireland, a lot of Irish people struggle with TH, the sound TH, apparently because it doesn't exist in the Irish language. Now, even though I wasn't speaking Gaelic when I grew up, I did learn it, but I wasn't speaking it. It still doesn't exist. Let's just say in our palate, we find it really difficult to say. So when I moved, when I moved to England, people used to always laugh because I couldn't say it, and I would, for example, the number three, I would go tree, and I couldn't help it. So I had to learn a little exercise that it wouldn't naturally come out as tree. And the exercise that I used was three thick thistles. And these can be called also tongue twisters, but really what they are is they're an exercise. So I would say three thick thistles really slowly. Always say them slowly, because the thing why they're called tongue twisters is if you try to say them fast, that's when you mess up. So I would usually say it a few times and then get confident and go faster. And then I'd say three chick thistles. So say three thick thistles. Now, your problem might not be TH, but there may be words that you find difficult to enunciate or pronounce. And so, when you're reading your poetry slowly, make sure that you're saying the whole word. Again, speak slowly and speak clearly. Okay, so my next tip on taking your first steps into reading poetry and getting more confident with it and looking at it and all the rest is to pay attention to the title. Now, that might seem really obvious or not obvious at all, but there it is. Pay attention to the title. Why this is so important is that the poet, even though he may start putting random words together, usually brings all of the poem together in the title. Not always, but sometimes. For example, and I'm not going to give you loads of examples, I'll just give you one that springs to mind right now. Choric Song of the Lotus Eaters by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Choric Song of the Lotus Eaters. It's right there in the title. The guys are eating the lotus leaf. They are high. And what does the lotus, if you look up the effects of the lotus leaf on people, it makes them want to tune in, drop out. And the minute you start reading, you get the effect of the lotus leaf. These people are high, they're tuning in, they're dropping out, they don't want to leave their island paradise. So, from the title, the poem makes sense. If you went straight into the poem and didn't pay any attention to the title, it mightn't just make any sense to you. You might be more disconnected to it. And there are hundreds of examples like this. So pay attention to the title. I guarantee you there's a clue to the meaning of the entire poem in the title. Okay, so my next tip on getting into poetry is kind of comes under the intimidation. It doesn't need to cost you any money. And I think that's very important that when you're taking these baby steps, you don't rush out and buy the most advanced poetry in the world. What I recommend you do is go to a website like Poem Hunter, and you may actually be looking for a poem because you're going through something in your life. Maybe you're going through grief. Maybe you're going through a breakup. Maybe you're in love and you want to find somebody who has expressed those feelings in words. So go to a website called Poem Hunter and just type it in the search engine, poems about love, poems about grief, and you'll get a list of poems, and have a look at them and see is there one that resonates with you. Following on from that, there's poetry magazines. There's also poem anthologies. Now, these are great if you really want to dive deep into poetry, but just start small. That's my best advice to you. Start small with poetry. And if you go to these websites like Poem Hunter, for example, and you find poems that you do like, then you find out who the writer is, and then you look at their other work and you think, wow, they really resonate with me. And sometimes when you read about a poet's life and you read what they went through in their life, like for example, Keats, people always presume he was a romantic poet, and a lot of these romantic poets, went to Oxbridge and they had very privileged lives. But Keats actually was somebody who was sick from a very young age, so he had a lot of burdens, and also he wasn't classically trained, or maybe in his day people intimidated him about his knowledge. So also find out a little bit about poets, and maybe you've got something in common with them. And then when you've got something in common with them, you empathize with them. And then when you read their work, it resonates with you to a higher degree. So that's my next tip on getting into poetry. So this is going to be my final tips on getting into poetry and feeling more confident reading poetry. And it's going to cover a few points. Um, what I'd like to say to you is to play with your voice and play with delivery. When I used to always read my daughter bedtime stories, I would read all of the characters in a different voice. I want you to get really playful and childlike, and like, no, read it like nobody's watching, and I guarantee you'll find some sort of happy spot in there somewhere, how it should be read or how it feels comfortable to you, which is moving on to my next point, which is that creative writing is creative reading, and there's no one set way of reading a poem, and there's also no set interpretation. So, this is a really important point. When I used to record the lectures of the Yeats Society, I would hear all these poet laureates come from all over the world analysing his poetry. And um, a lot of their analysation was also guesswork. So, of course, they could be guessing wrong. And, take, for example, one line, they might say, oh, he was feeling this and he was going through this in his life and XYZ was happening. But maybe that line, he just meant exactly what it was. So the thing is that there's no set way in saying a poem, just as there's no set way as analyzing it. And really, when an artist creates a piece of work, somebody else can take it and make it into something else. This is done with theater, this is done with film, this is done with song. So poetry is no different. So that will help you go back to number one and not be intimidated. Who's to say that your way of saying the poem is not the right way? Don't let anyone ever say that to you. And there it is. Those are my few tips to get you into poetry, to get you started, that hopefully one day you'll be buying poetry books and ultimately you'll be writing your own. Thank you so much for watching. And after all that, I completely forgot to tell you, I've got an amazing course coming this June 2nd, just a few days away from now, in performance and speaking. Get your exclusive link exclusively here from Words with Ro.